Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to the Great Books program of the Wisdom School of Ubiquity University. And it is my pleasure today to continue our discussion of Plutarch. You remember that last month I started our examination of Plutarch by just taking two of his parallel lives. Just to refresh everybody's memory, Plutarch was born about 40 AD, so shortly after the death of Christ, and lived his life mostly in Greece. He studied at Plato's academy. He was a priest to the Oracle of Delphi for the last 30 years of his life. He wrote a number of books. He was a deeply spiritual man. He was deeply immersed in the Eleusinian mysteries, in the mysteries of Isis that were current in the Mediterranean world. And he turned his creative intelligence to writing biographies of great Greeks and Romans. And he did them in parallel. So the original work was parallel lives of great noble Greeks and Romans. We don't have all of them. Some of them that we do have are truncated, but we have many of them. And so the two that I have been inspired by much of my life are the great tales of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Those were the two that he paired together. Alexander the Great is arguably the greatest general in history, never lost a battle, and never fought an enemy in which he wasn't vastly outnumbered. So his genius was lauded even during his day, and certainly for the last 2,500 years. There hasn't been a general that really approximates Alexander. But Julius Caesar is one of them. Genghis Khan is one of them. Napoleon is one of them. They come, close second and thirds. So Plutarch paired Julius Caesar with Alexander. And my interest in exploring these great lives was very much around understanding the phenomenon of Donald Trump and the very precarious nature of the American Republic in our time. You'll recall during my discussion of Alexander, the point that I was making about Alexander is he's an example of how a major personality can come into history and establish presence simply by the mere force of genius. And we see it not only in the political and military realm, we see it in science, we see it in art. One thinks of Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. We see it in science. One thinks of Pythagoras, for example. One thinks of Einstein. The great lines of Vasari that wrote the biography of the great artist during the Renaissance. When he came to the chapter on Michelangelo, he says, no one can explain the genius of Michelangelo. How do you carve the Pietà, a work of complete perfection, out of a single block of marble? And you're only 18 years old. How does that happen? And the answer that Vasari gave about Michelangelo is that occasionally God looks down, he says, and sees the misery of men, and out of his great compassion creates someone to remind us of beauty. And that's probably the best explanation of Michelangelo that I know, having seen the Pietà and the David and Moses and his other great works, the Sistine Chapel. And so when one comes to Alexander and some such great figures, one is dealing with almost a mutation. And I wanted to tease that particular aspect out about Alexander, because when we come to someone like Donald Trump, we're dealing in the United States, maybe for the first time in our history, with what history calls a strong man. Someone who bursts into the political arena, doesn't obey any of the rules, challenged 16 other candidates for the Republican nomination, and in the process wiped them all away, took on Fox News, tamed the Republican Party, committed treason with the Russians to steal the US election, and now reigns supreme out of the Oval Office of the White House of the United States as president of this country. And it happened so fast and without any warning that the mainstream democratic institutions were unable to stop his rise to power. Even though it's in plain sight, the level of criminality that he exercised to seize the office. With Julius Caesar, I want to go to the opposite. I want to talk not so much about the man as the history. Remember, I raised this question that historians have raised for centuries. You know, does history make the individual, or does the individual make history? And that's an ongoing debate. And with Julius Caesar, I want to talk about the context within which Caesar rose. And I want to use it as a distant mirror to what is happening in the United States, and why, as I want to submit as a thesis for you to consider, that Donald Trump is an inevitability given the deconstruction that we are witnessing in our generation, in our day, of the American Republic. So if one begins to understand Donald Trump not as a cause, but as an effect of deeper historical processes at work, one begins to take on the true danger that the United States is now in. So that's my opening assertion that I would like to now explore. And as you know, it has been said by many that history never repeats itself, but history does rhyme. History does rhyme. And the great patterns cycle through with different details and different actors. But after the passage of the cycle, one can look back and see similarities. And if there's any empire with which the United States can be compared, it's the Empire of Rome. The Americans are the new Romans. And that, of course, has been observed by historians and commentators for over 100 years. But it's something that is worth contemplating as we look at the life of Julius Caesar and we look at the current challenges besetting the United States of America. So what I want to do over the next 30, 40 minutes is to lay out, first of all, a very brief summary of the historical context within which Julius Caesar was born. He was born in 100 BC. And he was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. And during that time, the Roman Republic was collapsing. Just to refresh everybody's memory, remember the stories of Romulus and Remus in the 8th century. And legend has it that Romulus and Remus built the city of Rome. And Romulus, in that process, killed his brother Remus and became the first king of Rome. And from that time until about 509 BC, the Romans were governed by a king. And the kings became so imperious that finally there was a great revolution and the Romans established a republic. And that republic had a series of checks and balances. Unlike the Athenian democracy, which was pure democracy. In the Athens of Pericles, the assembly, every free man was required to vote, and the democracy ruled. In Rome, very much like the United States, they never had a direct democracy. They were a republic. Athens was not a republic. Athens was a true democracy. The United States is not a democracy. It's a republic where the vote is always indirect and doesn't reflect the will of the people. In Rome, the great division was between the patrician class, the aristocracy, and the plebeians. And like in any democratic process, there was a process taking centuries through which the plebeians, the general population, began to assert power. Now, just as a reference for that, in 1776, when the United States declared independence, the Constitution gave white men who owned property the right to vote. Women couldn't vote. White men who didn't own property couldn't vote. Black people by the Constitution were considered only 2/3 of a human being. And we had to literally fight a civil war before Black people were emancipated. It wasn't until the early part of the 20th century, 100 years ago, that women were finally emancipated. And even to the present day, the Republican Party in particular is trying to figure out all kinds of ways of denying people the vote. That happened in Rome, where over the centuries, great titanic battles were fought until finally about the middle of the 3rd century, there was a checks and balances that had organically evolved in the Roman Republic, just like the democratic institutions have evolved in the United States. We fought a civil war for it. So power and the exercise of power is always something that is conflictual by its very nature. And then in the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome had that epic struggle with Carthage. Remember Hannibal at the end of the 3rd century, coming over from Spain and coming down through the Alps and attacking Rome. And for 10 years, he afflicted the Romans. And the Romans finally, under a young general, 23 years old, that was given the generalship because of his brilliance, another Scipio, Africanus as he was called. Instead of attacking Hannibal, he attacked Carthage. And Hannibal went back. Scipio defeated him in a major battle. And the Roman Republic then burst into the Mediterranean and seized first Macedonia, then Greece, then Syria, then Palestine, and eventually under Augustus seized Egypt. Rome also expanded the length and breadth of Italy and began to colonize Spain. So you had two things happening simultaneously, which is very important for Americans and people who are witnessing America to observe. Rome, the United States, became imperial powers and began to bring vast wealth back to the homeland. And the vast wealth, the United States is something like 5% of the world's population, consuming between 25 and 30% of all the world's resources. People starve while we go to Safeway. That was true in Rome. And what began to happen around the 2nd century, shortly the century before Julius Caesar, is that the rich began to get richer, the poor began to get poorer, and one of the things that began to complicate Roman life was the massive increase in slaves. Just imagine the hundreds and thousands and millions of slaves that were brought back to Rome as Rome conquered the Mediterranean world. One of the stories I was reading, one general alone took a week to defeat Sardinia. They attacked Sardinia. And in 1 week, they created 60,000 slaves that were shipped to Italy. Well, what began to happen is that all that wealth was going to the patrician class. They owned all the slaves. So what did they begin to do? They began to buy up land, forced homeowners off the land, and began really the world's first commercial farming. Right now in the United States, I think 6 companies own 90% of the farmland. That's not new. That's what happened in Rome. So you had massive dislocation of peoples, massive accumulation of wealth, the usurpation of power by the aristocratic class to push more and more people off their land. And where did they show up? They showed up in the cities. The vast immigrations to the cities. In the year 200, Rome had 50,000 population. In the year 60, it had 600,000 population. It was easily the biggest city in the world. At the same time, and I want you to think about dreamers and some of the immigrants here in the United States. At the same time, as Rome expanded, particularly in Italy, they conquered the Sabines, they conquered the Etruscans, they conquered the folks in Naples, they conquered up in the Po Valley, they conquered all these people, but they didn't enfranchise them. But they used them for their armies. So by the year 100, 2/3 of Italy, all conquered by Rome, were Roman subjects without the vote. And finally, and they were the ones that were fighting in the armies. So finally, they revolted around 90 BC, when Caesar was 10 years old. That was the first of the civil wars. At the end of the civil wars, they got the vote. And it was bloody, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And just like it took a civil war in the United States to gain the emancipation, so it took a civil war in Rome for the Italians. These weren't the Carthaginians, these weren't the Greeks, these weren't the Gauls, the Celts, these were the Italians. The Romans wouldn't even give the Italians the vote until there was huge bloodletting. Now, obviously, as this was all going on, order had to be assured. And the Roman equivalent of the national security state that began to emerge was the power of the legions. As the traditional institutions began to break down, as increasing polarization of the polity, largely driven by dispossessed people and slaves, and economic duress and dislocation and exploitation, those generals that began to control the military, the legions, began to realize that they were the ones who were the ultimate arbiters of power. It was not the Roman Senate that adjudicated the civil war with the Italian city-states. It was two major generals, Sulla and Marius. Marius was Julius Caesar's uncle. Caesar came from a patrician class, as I mentioned, the Julia. And they traced their lineage through Aeneas, who you may remember was the Trojan who escaped when the Trojan War was coming to a close and came to Italy, founded Rome, according to that tradition. And Aeneas's ancestor was the goddess Venus, Aphrodite, called Venus by the Romans. So Julius Caesar, like Alexander the Great, had a noble lineage that traced back to a god. Marius was the first of the strong men of the Roman Republic. And these strong men began to systematically break down the institutional structures that had founded Rome and given Rome its strength over the centuries over which it had endured and grown and now had conquered the entire Mediterranean world. So that the external expansion of power, and this is important, the external expansion of power of Rome caused the consolidation of power inside Rome. First, by the increasing power of the rich, and secondly, the increasing power of the legions. And if you think about what's going on in the United States for a moment, you have basically the same phenomenon. The United States emerged after World War II as the greatest power on earth, with 1,200 bases and military facilities around the planet. It was the first imperial system to consolidate its power everywhere. And as you know, the United States is also dominates space. So the economic and military and political control of the United States over planet Earth from 1945 has been more significant than probably any imperial system in the history of the world. And the wealth that's come to the United States. And what have we seen over the last 60 years, 70 years? We see a concentration of power. We see a greater and greater disparity between rich and the poor. We see more and more polarization of the political forces between the extreme left and the extreme right. We see the rise of the national security state. And what is predicted as those forces deconstruct the institutions that build the country, we begin to get strongmen. And I would suggest for your contemplation today that Trump is a function of the deconstruction of the American Republic. He is not some random guy that showed up and all we have to do is kind of get rid of him and everything's going to be okay again. Now, some of you may take issue with this, but I believe we're in our time, we're witnessing the decline and fall of the American imperium. Because it is rhyming in so many ways with great imperial systems that succumb out of the contradiction of power, the conflict between classes, the disintegration of the founding institution, and therefore the emerging of what we call a national security state. And when you have a national security state, democracy cannot endure. Concentration of power is what has created what Arthur Schlesinger's called 30 years ago the imperial presidency. The first exemplar of which was Franklin Roosevelt. Right at the moment the United States emerged as a global imperium, we had our strongest president, and he established the imperial presidency. So it's within that context that I want to start to refer to Julius Caesar. And I want to just tell some stories. Remember, Plutarch says that he was less interested in a narration of events than depicting a person's character. And that's why in my lectures around Alexander, I took different vignettes to show the character of of Alexander. And now I want to do the same thing by referring to various incidences, but I want to tease out the corruption of Caesar. Alexander the Great did not have a corrupt bone in his body. He was a young man of 22 when he invaded Persia, and he kept the flame alive till he died 10 years later. He was not interested in wealth. He wasn't interested in power. He was interested in fame and glory and honor. Not true Julius Caesar. And not true Trump. So right at the beginning of Plutarch's account, he tells a very telling story of Caesar, bearing in mind that, remember Marius, a great general, with his legions, Sulla. When it was all over, Marius was out, Sulla controlled Rome. And Sulla was going to kill Caesar. It's part of the prescription. He killed thousands of people. He was going to kill Caesar. And his advisors said, hey, he's too young. And Sulla said, there are many Mariuses in that young man, but he let it go. Biggest mistake he made. Caesar fled. Totally predictably. He ran away. And he was running away and he gets captured by pirates. And the pirates say, I will let you go if you arrange for 20 talents as a ransom. And Julius Caesar laughed at them and said, you have no idea who you're dealing with. You should be asking for at least 70 talents. And they said, okay, 70 talents. And he says, I'm going to pay those 70 talents. And when it's all done and I'm freed, I'm going to come back and crucify the whole lot of you. And he wrote poetry and he sang songs and he just took over the ship, basically. And they were very entertained. And sure enough, sometime later, after he was regaling them with stories and they became completely infatuated with Caesar, his ransom came. He went back to Rome. Sulla had sort of forgotten about him. He got some troops together, went down, found where the pirates were, and crucified the whole bunch of them, just like he said he was going to do. Came back to Rome and started to engage in politics. And in politics at that time, demagoguery was the way to power because of all these dispossessed people that were flooding into the cities. They all voted in their tribal groups, and even though they were dispossessed and they had demands, and so Marius was representing the populari, Sulla, the conservatives, the patricians. And Julius Caesar came into his political pathway as a demagogue, spending lavish amounts of money in bribes and in entertainments of all sort to build his power base among the people. And I just want to read a few little vignettes here that after the death of his wife, he was appointed quaestor through massive bribes and expenditures of money. And then he was appointed curator of the Appian Way, a major roadway coming into Rome. And he expended upon it vast sums of his own money, says Plutarch. And again, during his aedileship, which was another one of the offices that a young man typically ran for. All of them were voted in yearly elections. And to do that, it says he furnished 320 pairs of gladiators and by lavish provision besides for theatrical performances, processions, and public banquets. He washed away all memory of the ambitious efforts of his predecessors in the office. And by these means, he put the people in such a humor that every man of them was seeking out new offices and new honors with which to requite them. And he became a major figure in Rome. And the next thing that he achieved was a triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey, Crassus being the most wealthy man in Rome, and Pompey being the greatest general in Rome. They hated each other. Caesar contrived an alliance as a go-between between these great senior men of Rome. And they were persuaded by Caesar to back him to become consul, which was the highest office in the land. There were 2 consuls. They served for 1 year. And he chose a non-entity as his running mate. And as soon as he was triumphantly elected, having bribed with more money than anybody else on election day, reading again from Plutarch in chapter 14, he proposed laws which were becoming not for a council, but for a most radical tribune of the people. When I was talking about the centuries of conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, one of the offices that had emerged after much bloodshed and conflict was the office of the tribune, that could protect any of the lower classes of people from what the council was demanding. So here, Caesar, going into the Senate, asked for radical reforms that were going to favor the people. And to gratify the multitude, he introduced sundry allotments and distributions of land. In the Senate, the opposition of men of the better sort gave him the pretext which he had long desired, and was compelled to vote everything he wanted. And just to pick, you're in the Senate. He stationed Crassus on the side, one side of him, and Pompey on the other side. And he asked both of them if they approved his laws. And they declared that they did approve them. Whereupon he urged them to give their aid and against those who threatened to oppose him with swords. They promised him such aid. And Pompey, the great general, actually added that he would come up against swords with sword and a buckler too. So I want you to just sort of fast forward here to what's happening right now in the United States. You have a man in the White House that committed treason, colluding with the Russians to manipulate voting machines, to steal emails from the Democratic National Committee, to manipulate in a massive way social media on Facebook and Twitter and all the things we all know Trump is guilty of. Julius Caesar was that flagrant. And now what's happening? Trump controls the Senate. He controls the House of Representatives because he controls the Republican Party. He controls Fox News. So we have a situation in our country like Rome around Julius Caesar, where the corruption is being publicly exercised without apology. You have a president who lies, distorts the truth. You have a Republican Party that is so obsequious, they're doing everything they can in collusion with Trump to neutralize Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor. They're selectively targeting high officials of the FBI, the CIA, for firing. And the American people are watching this as if they're watching a theater, just like in ancient Rome. History rhymes. History rhymes. And unchallenged, Caesar then, in 58 BC, got the governorship of Gaul, what is now France. And that began his greatness. And I want to make this point because it's hard sometimes because we like the world in black and white. Somebody can be a crook and can destroy democratic institutions and still become a great man and be known in history as one of the great personages, certainly of Rome. The entire history of Rome lasted over 1,000 years. Julius Caesar, along with Caesar Augustus, are probably the two of the greatest figures of Rome. And, how did that happen is a very interesting question. But I'd like to take a short break here because I don't want to demean Julius Caesar as like Trump. Julius Caesar was a great man. And I'm going to enumerate his greatness in a moment here. Trump does not even come up to Caesar's kneecaps. But I am telling this story because one of the things that Julius Caesar did do is he destroyed the Republic. And he set in motion and is responsible for the begin of one-man dictatorship in Rome. And that was Caesar Augustus. After Julius Caesar, Rome was governed by one man until it fell in the 5th century AD in the West and the 15th century in the East. And that nexus is what I want to dwell on. But I also want to just remind us, since we're talking about Julius Caesar here, what an extraordinary human being he also was. And you can get a measure of that by something I just want to read to you, where Plutarch comments on the greatness of Caesar. He compares Caesar to other great Roman generals and leader, Fabius, Scipio, and Metellus. He tells their lives and others of his parallel lives, and I would recommend Plutarch to all of you for all of his noble lives. But he says Caesar will be found to surpass them all in his achievements. One, he surpassed in the difficulty of the regions where he waged his wars. Another, in the great extent of country which he acquired. another in the multitude and might of the enemies over whom he was victorious, another in the savage manners and perfidious dispositions of the people whom he conciliated. Think Crassus and Pompey. He was a great general. He could conquer, but he could also conciliate. Trump, for example, is completely devoid of any capacity to conciliate. Another in his reasonableness and in mildness toward his captives. That was a characteristic, remember, of Alexander. Terrible in battle, generous in victory. Another still in the gifts and favors which he bestowed upon his soldiers, and all in the fact that he fought the most battles and killed the most enemies. For although it was not full 10 years that he waged war in Gaul, he took by storm more than 800 cities, subdued 300 nations. Think about this. And fought pitched battles at different times with 3 million men, of whom he slew 1 million in hand-to-hand fighting, and took as many more as prisoners. And if you look at chapter 16, it talks about the complete devotion of his troops. And Caesar himself, who was a small man, like Alexander, and he was very sickly, he hammered himself, he hardened himself by sleeping on the ground with his troops, riding with the troops, marching with the troops, eating with the troops. He hardened his body through war by doing everything that his troops would do. And he was an excellent horseman. And he could ride at a full gallop with his hands behind his back. And he would often, as the troops were walking around, he'd have a scribe on either side of him, and he would be dictating letters. But I want to just read you one part, just so you get the grandeur of these lives. Many battles up in Gaul and then into Germany and Belgium and Holland, what's now Luxembourg, up into Britain, into Spain. But it talks about just one of the battles. He had just defeated one tribe and placed their families and possessions in a recess of the forest, and was fortifying a camp and did not expect any more battle. When all of a sudden, 60,000 troops from another tribe descended upon him and routed his cavalry, surrounded the 7th and 12th legions, and slew all their centurions. And Plutarch says, and had not Caesar snatched a shield and made his way through the combatants in front of him and hurled himself upon the barbarians, and had not the 10th legion at the sight of his peril run down from the heights and cut the ranks of the enemies to pieces, not a Roman, it is thought, would have survived. As it was, however, owing to Caesar's daring, they fought beyond their powers, as the saying is, and even then did not rout the Nervii, but cut them down as they defended themselves. For out of 60,000, only 500 are said to have come off alive, and only 3 of their senators out of 400. So that gives you a measure of the man that Caesar was. He was there in the trenches. He always led his men. So when he finished with his 10 years in France, he had a veteran army, 12 legions strong. It's about 70,000 men. And then, as you all know, it came time for him to return to Rome. And Rome was terrified. And the famous story of the Rubicon, when he crossed the Rubicon, there was great negotiations between him and Pompey. Crassus had thought, well, if Caesar can win at war, I can win at war. He had gone off to the Parthians in eastern Turkey and had been completely wiped out, killed. The richest man in Rome. So doing what Caesar did, as I just described, was not so easy. And his enemies in the Senate, knowing that if he gave up his imperium, as they called it, because if you were a general, but you were excluded from any prosecution. You were exempt from any prosecution. So in order to go to Rome, he had to give up his generalship. If he gave up his generalship, he could be charged for all the crimes that he committed in embezzling and bribing and manipulating the Senate and threatening and all the things that he did also. And so there was a great debate and negotiation between him and Pompey. And at the end, the negotiations broke down and Caesar crossed the Rubicon with 12 legions. And to make a long story very short, conquered, destroyed Pompey's army in Greece, came back to Rome, and then made his crucial mistake. And his crucial mistake was in thinking the time had come for him to be king. And so over the next 4 years, from about 48 to 44, he consolidated increasing power. His vanity got the best of him. And finally, he was assassinated because he wanted to be king. And even though the Romans were willing to tolerate a strong man, they were not willing to call him Julius Rex, Julius the king. And that was what catalyzed the assassination plot. And I want to just read parts of the way Plutarch describes the assassination. And I want to refer back to what I was teasing out about Alexander, the omens. Remember, after Alexander had made it to the Ganges River, his troops mutinied. They loved him, but they just couldn't keep going. They were completely exhausted. And Alexander kept going. He almost got himself killed. They pulled him back. Took him months to recover. Finally, he made it back. And all of a sudden, evil omens started to show up. And Alexander began to lose his power. Finally, he died, age 32. It's said of malaria. The greatest general in the history of the world was felled by a mosquito. Plutarch starts chapter 63 with an amazing statement. Destiny, it would seem, is not so much unexpected as it is unavoidable. Since they say that amazing signs and apparitions were seen. Will has been informing us of the birth of the white buffalo. And in the Native American tradition, in that part of the North America, the white buffalo is an omen. So there's been much excitement in the Earth Tribe and in the Wisdom School around the omen. Now let's think about omens for a minute. Destiny. Is it unavoidable? What produces a white buffalo? When a white buffalo appears, what does this actually mean? What does it actually mean? With Caesar, there were omens. A certain seer warned Caesar to be on his guard against a great peril on the day of the month of March, which the Romans call the Ides, 15th of March. It's one reason why I chose Julius Caesar. It's the 15th of March in about a month. And when the day had come and Caesar was on his way to the Senate house, he greeted the seer with a jest and said, "Well, the Ides of March are come." And the seer said to him softly, "Aye, they are come, but they are not yet gone." Moreover, on the day before, when Marcus Lepidus was entertaining him at supper, Caesar chanced to be signing letters, as was his custom, while reclining at table, and the discourse turned suddenly upon the question, what sort of death was the best? Before anyone could answer, Caesar cried out, "That which is unexpected, that death is the best." After this, while he was sleeping as usual by the side of his wife, all the doors and windows of the chamber flew open at once. And Caesar, confounded by the noise and the light of the moon shining down upon him, noticed that Calpurnia, his wife, was in a deep slumber, but was uttering indistinct words and inarticulate groans in her sleep. For she dreamed that she was holding her murdered husband in her arms and bewailing him. Undeterred, Caesar went to the Senate. He was accompanied by Mark Antony. By the conspiracy, Mark Antony was detained in an extended conversation by one of the conspirators. Caesar went in to the Senate house, and there over 20 senators fell upon him. And by agreement, every one of them had to stab him with a dagger. And when he fell, as it turned out, right beside a statue of Pompey, Brutus, the man he had saved during the battle in which he conquered Pompey. Brutus was on the other side. And Julius Caesar, being a very forgiving man, had forgiven him. "Come back, work for me." And when Brutus brought down the dagger, the famous lines, "E tu, Brute," Caesar knew it was lost and surrendered to death. Trump is in the White House. Was he unexpected? Or, as Plutarch suggests, is Trump unavoidable, given the deconstruction of the American Republic and the concentration of power in a national security state, the polarization of political discourse, and the inabilities of our great institutions founded over 250 years ago to continue to function in an effective way? time and time again, not just in Rome, a strong man emerges, breaks all the rules, confounds all the pundits, seizes power, and destroys the very institutions that allowed him to rise. Many of them endure. Caesar did not. But we here in America have some fundamental choices to make about this strong man. He needs to be impeached, obviously, for his criminality. But more deeply, the American polity gave rise to Trump because it's broken. And what we do, even after we get rid of Trump, will determine our fate. Because Julius Caesar was the last of the strong men. There was Marius, there was Sulla, there was Crassus, there was Pompey. And then there was Julius Caesar. And after Julius Caesar came Augustus Caesar. And the complete absorption of the republic into the empire controlled by one man. I think I'll end it there. And again, my point with this discourse is not to either judge or to declare, but to raise very fundamental questions about the nature of a republic in decline, the inevitability of a seizure of power, and how democracies once wounded, how can they put Humpty Dumpty back together again? When Humpty Dumpty is broken. That's the challenge of Julius Caesar. Rome never recovered from Caesar. We're in the middle of Trump. And for us, history is not yet written until we write it. So we're gonna, let's see, there's lots of people on the line. This is great. I'd like to have anyone who wants to comment, question, disagree, however we do this, please raise your hand. You can, let's see, Dr. Joy. I'd like to see what Joy has to say about this. Joy, welcome. Hey, Joy. So what's your sense of Trump in light of what I've said about Julius Caesar?
Well, way back in the beginning when you started, I was really in sync with you around the fact that it wasn't just one man, that there's nothing special about it. It would have been someone else, because the system has been broken for a long time for so many people. And so it's almost like someone said, all the conditions were there so that what happened, because the things that would have stopped it from happening weren't present. And what was present was what we've been living with and living through. I don't know. I've just been pondering the whole, even taking a deep snooze through the absolute mess and mire that we live with, and trying not to jump to how to fix it, just to try to understand it through your lecture and through reading. What are some possibilities, that we could consider?
Yeah, it's not an easy process to work through. When you're in it, there's not so much clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you get, as the Romans did, as Americans, you get so used to being oppressed, disenfranchised, and disempowered. After a while, that becomes what's normal.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rise of someone like Trump then is viewed by some as a deliverance. How many people thought, well, the system is broken, I'm just going to vote for Trump just for a change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's also part of the energy that gives rise to a strong man like Trump. And one of the reasons why they're not so easy to get rid of, even when their criminality is obvious.
Right.
So, well, thank you. Let me turn to, I don't know who the person is. It's the Green Machine has said that he or she wants to talk.
Isn't it a bit premature to proclaim his guilt when the investigation is still ongoing?
Well, I don't think so. Just like with Nixon, I lived through Nixon. We knew he was guilty long before he resigned. That's clear from the public record. It's clear from all the evidence coming out. Mueller, if given leeway, will surely bring the charges against him. As you know, there's been 2 out of the 4 people already charged have pled guilty. And a third one is apparently in the process. So I think there's enough evidence on Trump to know that he's a pretty seriously bad guy. I mean, just in terms of his rhetoric, to say nothing about his treatment of women. But it's mostly what brings down a president is his criminality, his lying. It's a lie. It's a crime if you're president. When you lie to the Senate, when you lie in a completely promiscuous, indiscriminate way. And that's why, as you know, his lawyers don't want him to testify. But at the same time, you're right that under law, you're innocent until guilty. But that he should be impeached, I think, is manifest. There's upwards of 50% of the American public now want him impeached.
That's not the standard for impeachment. Don't you think it's a little irresponsible to ignore due process and danger?
Oh, no, we're going through due process. We're going through due process. That's what we have to preserve. You see, that's the danger right now with the special prosecutor and the Republican memo last week, and the statements and the going after Rosenstein, the deputy FBI director, is the insidious manipulation of the due process. That's what we have to now preserve as Americans through our elected representatives, is the due process to allow the special counsel to do his work. That's what will now play out. And as you know, Richard Nixon tried to violate due process. And that record is much more clear because it's in hindsight. And Trump is guilty of far worse. And the machinery of government is now working, and we'll see if it carries through. And if you remember, I don't know how much anybody remembers of the Nixon time, but he almost got away with it. He almost got away with it. It wasn't until the Republican Party turned that he resigned. And at some point, that's what will have to happen with Trump, is the Republican Party will have to turn, or we'll get through the midterms and we'll vote in the Democrats, and then we'll have a different equation in the Senate and the House. But due process is crucial, absolutely crucial. And that's why we're all on pins and needles as Americans, to make sure that the due process actually is allowed to work in a constitutional way. That's what the special prosecutor is about. Okay, Will, do you have anything you want to say? Or I didn't see Siegfried here. Yeah.
Do you see me?
Yeah.
Can you see me? Okay. Yeah, yeah, great. Well, I'm hearing from Europe, and Jim, I also see the parallels which you point out from Caesar and the old Rome and all like this. But I want to point out another thing, because I'm not an American. I come from outside, and sometimes in the States. And I think there is some hope if you see from outside, because I never experienced in the many years I visited the States that the people, no matter if you're in the North or in the South, or if you're in Texas or New York, are so political and they are so engaged. Of course, the democratic institutions are moaning in the moment in the States, and it's really a hard time. But I think I have confidence into the fact that the people, they will be able to change, because many people, I never experienced this before, even especially not in Texas, that people are so political, that they have an opinion. Normally, if you talk to people, especially in the South, they deal with their own business, and Washington is far away, and they don't want to get engaged. There's an election every 4 years, of course, and afterwards everybody goes back to business. And I think my impression is it is not like this after Trump has been elected. And yeah, I think
right. He has certainly activated political discourse.
Yeah, and this is good, and
Yeah.
and it brings a lot of hope, I think, also. Yeah, of course, there is a hard time, and I'm happy that I'm not living in the States in the moment, because it is really a hard time. I enjoy to live in Austria, but I think there is a lot of capacity, and the history does not necessarily have to repeat itself like it was in Caesar's time.
Yeah.
Rome. Yeah.
Well, no, that's a very important point. Thank you for raising it. I'm not sure of this statistic, but it's something along the following lines, that in 2012 or 2016, there was something like 7,000 women running for office, and there's now 23,000 women running for office for the midterms.
Yeah.
So the amount of women and progressives that are just pouring into blue states, red states, county clerk, governorships, Senate, at every level of the political process, women, progressive women, are running, and that's a very important point. I thank you for raising it. That's why I was saying history rhymes. We're in the middle of it with Trump. How we come out of it, whether we learn and revitalize our institutions, or to go back to the last caller, whether the constitutional process is subverted and the national security state consolidated, that's the choice point. But you're absolutely right. There's been more political discourse in the United States since the election of Donald Trump than any time, I would say. Will, Mark, you guys comment, but I would say since the Vietnam War, since Nixon. since the 60s, early 70s, I think we're at another pitch point of political discourse, but there may be different recollections of history. Well, there's Gene, and then I want our Mark, Will, and Georgie to comment, and then maybe we'll see who else. But let's go to Gene Fleury.
I hope I can articulate this, that these times, even though there's a certain amount of rhyming, that it's a very much more potent time because of we're all globally connected and interconnected, and we recognize this now. And I would submit that, and I just love that you're bringing this up in the huge historical context, because the issues of power and learning about power, humanity has been struggling with this for at least, even before Alexander and Trump. But I feel that this is a time of a great opportunity for a great leap or maturation about power itself, and and a moral leap, spiritual leap, societal leap. This is really needed because it's not only our relationship with one another, it's our relationship with the planet. And that when you make reference to these oracles that you've made reference to, and now you're making reference to the white buffalo calf, that there's much more power. In Lakota, they call it, they say, ska ska. Power is moving. And that's what I participate with. Power is moving. And so, yes, I love that the populace and the greater populace is really getting more involved, because that's been part of the problem with the power, has been the diminution, the whole using humans as cannon fodder for wars, that we're really miraculous beings, and we haven't recognized that yet. So we're imputing this greatness onto different archetypal energies and things, but that's us. This is us. So this is I think we're challenged right now to mature. I mean, to spiritually, morally mature, and that this discourse should be brought to the table everywhere. But unfortunately, so many are kept in ignorance. So anyway, I hope I've captured at least a bit of flavor of this.
Thank you. Thank you. And there's no doubt, that there's a spiritual potential here for real revolutionary transformation if we seize it. So
let's seize it.
Will, what do you have to say about all this? You're unmuted, so I figured you were up next.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Yes, I just want to point to a bridge from the understanding of Alexander and Julius Caesar as great, that I would question. Great in the context of the patriarchy and history's patriarchy. But when next we meet, we'll be looking at a woman who is a bridge from the patriarchy to what we're moving toward. And I love your thesis that there's a massive deconstruction going on, and that there's a sense that we've been through this before in some way. And I think we'll begin to explore in March and April where we're going in this bridge between the patriarchy and a more sacred feminine view of the world and experience of the world. indicated and ushered in some ways through Rachel Carson. So I would contrast, as you read Rachel Carson and as you look into her life a little bit, that you would contrast that with Alexander and see how that comparison plays out. So that's what I was saying. I want to hear what Georgie has to say.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Will. And just so everybody holds, that's next month is Will on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And that's a lot what we try to do here. We juxtapose opposites. So you have two exemplars of patriarchal war, and then Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And it's all part of the grand pleroma. Georgie?
Thank you, Jim. First of all, I'd like to congratulate on another wonderful lecture of yours. It was really exciting. I would like to point out two things, and after actually Mark finished, would like to bring Angie Azur to our midst because she sent us a very interesting message.
Oh, I haven't seen.
Yeah, I'm sure that she has something to say. The first thing I would like to shift the focus away from Caesar and Alexander to the storyteller, Plutarch, really, because I think that the storyteller is just as important as the story itself. And as you know, there is no such thing as 100% objective storytelling, because the storyteller always tells the story through his or her value system. Just like you said before, that Trump's news is Trump's news. Your news is a different news. Like Siegfried and I, we live in Europe. We see the American politics and what's going on slightly differently. Not that I disagree with your assessment whatsoever. But I really would like to know more about Plutarch. I know we don't have much time for it, and maybe I need to do my own research. But as a researcher, I would be interested in how did he do his own research in the time of when he was writing his parallel stories and so forth. Obviously, he didn't have internet and mobile phones, so he was relying his information on really what he knew and what he heard from other people. So his storytelling is very much based on how he saw these great men. And as you said at the very beginning of your lecture, that he was a very spiritual person. And I think he was really a very significant messenger. And I would like to read something which he wrote, and this really describes who Plutarch is. This is what he said in The Consolation. The soul, being eternal, after death is like a caged bird that has been released. If it has been a long time in the body and has become tame by many affairs and long habit, the soul will immediately take another body and once again become involved in the troubles of the world. The worst thing about old age is that the soul's memory of the other world grows dim, while at the same time its attachment to things of this world becomes so strong that the soul tends to retain the form that is had in the body. But that soul, which remains only a short time within the body, until liberated by the higher powers, quickly recovers its fire and goes on to higher things. I think this is really incredible what he wrote. You could say that it has relevance to Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, all Eastern traditions. I think he was really a truly, truly amazing man. So thank you very much for bringing him and his storytelling to us.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. He wrote a number of books of deep spirituality, aside from the parallel lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. And as I said before, he was a priest at the Oracle of Delphi for 30 years. Can you imagine being a priest at the Oracle of Delphi, the most sacred spot, some say in the entire Mediterranean world, where oracles lived and spoke to people of all walks of life. That must have been an incredible experience. And then to spend time in his youth at Plato's Academy. Plato was long gone, of course, but Plato's Academy stood for about 900 years. So Plato's Academy was about 500 years old, 400 or 500 years old by the time of Plutarch. But yes, thank you. He was a great man and is worth contemplating for books other than his Lives of Greeks and Romans, for which he's the most famous. But thank you. Mark, do you want to have any comment before we leave
Sure.
here?
I'm conscious of the time, so stop me if I begin to talk over. But first of all, I have to say that I just love this conversation. That was a brilliant analysis, and the remarks of others have just been wonderful. I'd like to reinforce some of Siegfried's comments and Jean's, I think, and also your own analysis by just referring to two things. One, very briefly, is that I see that energy very directly here in that energy of a re-engagement with politics very directly in my home city of Houston in Texas, where our city is relatively liberal, but the surrounding state is very conservative. The two neighboring congressional districts I live by have been gerrymandered to favor the Republicans, and both have Republican representatives in them right now. But there's been a marvelous engagement of candidates coming up there, about a dozen in one of those districts on the Democratic primary side, and the local newspaper, which tends to read Democratic, couldn't make up its mind because so many of them seem so good, and they could really win and turn those seats, and that's going on throughout the country. But I can't, as an American historian, I can't help but refer to this to reinforce your sense of the rhymes, Jim. The vision of Abraham Lincoln. You know, the parallel, the sense of those parallels of that rhyming was very strong for the founding fathers who set up these institutions in the U.S. You see it reflected throughout in place names. So many American towns are named for classical sites. And their ideal was not the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic. And that was very conscious. It was conscious among the founding fathers. It was conscious in the dialogue through the 19th century. And when he was still a young man, I think about 28 years old, Abraham Lincoln gave an address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield. It's known as the Lyceum Address, in which he basically spoke just as you did, Jim. He said, of course, what he had in mind was Napoleon. This was in 1838, which was just shortly after the Napoleonic era. But he says the danger of the collapse of the United States is not going to come from without. The public will always be able to face external enemies if it needs to, but it would come from within. And the reason it would come from within was because from his point of view, the great effort to establish Republican government was already won. And that called forth genius of leadership in the previous generations. But for his generation, what was required was the maintenance of those institutions. And that seems to be not such an exciting task for people of what he called genius. And he used that term like you did, not necessarily in an entirely complimentary way. He specifically spoke of not only Napoleon, but Alexander and Caesar in that address, and said that
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
And that the danger was that someone who wishes just to make his mark, to go with what you may have called, I think, honor or power too, but distinction, is not going to be satisfied just to maintain institutions. They'll want to shake things up. And there's a great danger of them shaking them up in the way that Napoleon, Caesar, and Alexander did. And that, therefore, what needs to happen, the counter to that is belief in the institutions. The counter to that is participation in the political world. It's the kind of thing that Siegfried was talking about. But as just to finish off here, I think in somewhat parallel fashion to Gene's remarks, Lincoln was a visionary, and he knew that it was precarious. He said there was a real question of whether government of the people, for the people, by the people shall not perish from the earth. But at the same time, he felt he could establish in the second inaugural address a vision of how it should be and what those omens could lead towards. And that is charity, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, and with malice towards none. That was the kind of society that he thought was could be held up as a vision, and to call forth the participation of people in the political process so as to counter the dangers from the Alexanders, Caesars, Napoleons, and Trumps. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good note on which to close. Thank you, Mark. Profound thinkers like Lincoln have contemplated these great issues. And so thank you all for contemplating them with me. I want to end by saying, nothing is written until we write it. And that's the importance of observing that history only rhymes. And we Americans have a challenge. We had a challenge in the Civil War. We had a challenge with Nixon in the Vietnam War. We have a challenge now with Trump. And as Siegfried said, one of the most extraordinary things that's happening in the United States right now is the rise of women in politics. And the way women and progressives are just running for offices all over this country. And in the face of the sustained attack on our institutions, to be revitalizing our institutions from the other direction is a very important potential outcome of this challenge that Trump is representing. So thank you for that. And next month, Will lead us with a great woman of our time, Rachel Carlson, whose book, Silent Spring, really catalyzed in some ways the entire environmental movement and helped shape the world that we know today. So thank you all. We'll meet the second Tuesday of March with Dr. Will Tagle. Bye, everyone.